I firstly would just like to give my honour, my identity, and what has been a symbolic importance in my life since as far back as I can remember in terms of my identity. I'd like to give reverence to our flag, the red, black and yellow. The black that represents the people of this land, the red that represents the earth and the bloodshed of our great warriors in the defence of the forced occupation of these lands, and the sun, the giver of life. I give no relevance to the Australian flag. I don't identify with it, and I reject it with every part of my spirit and my person. For I see it no less than a butcher's apron with the symbolic of the English Empire, the Union Jack, enforced its domination into the southern skies in the formation of our great storylines that run through the Southern Cross. My name is Robert Eggington, and I'm from one of 14 clan groups in the southwest of Western Australia. I'm a Wilman Kerang Marman. I come from the people of the Prongerups, the oldest granite formation on the earth, millions of years old. We are the people of the granite. We are also from the area in which on the planet flora first bore colour, the red of the kangaroo paw. We paint with our red wilgi, our ochre, which is the bloodline to our great moieties, the wadong, the crow, and the manage, the white cockatoo. Our links to fire, where we merge from our totemic existence, is from the karak, the fire bringer, and the rainmaker. As our communities plunge into darkness and chaos, I would like to give a tribute to the following: to the harmless, innocent and the peaceful souls who have been dragged into dark, damp prisons, for those who have had their children stolen away, for those who are facing the living hell and the despair of severe addiction, for those lost in the torment of mental illness, for those confused by the identity crisis of bloodlines, lost in finding a truth greater than that of sense of deceit and hypocrisy. For those of us in the freeze, suffering the insanity of ice. For those who are about to gouge their flesh to pieces and suffer the hurt of being alive, whilst they stand in the shadow between life and death and walk forward into the darkness. For our strong and brave who have survived the trauma and the pain of suffering racism. For our great warriors who fight with the power of their mind and their hearts and not weapons of steel or bombs. And especially to those of our young and frail who at this very moment are having their innocence shattered at the hands of monsters. For you, may our campfires burn forever. To my wife Selena, a tribute from the intimacy of the other side of fire, where the knowing was that you had the strength to carry the pain of your great loss. So the hunger greater than any dream that glimpses the beauty and shudders until eventually the ugliness is freed. For you, who have been the solace for so many, lost in the anguish of suffering and pain, the knowledge that forges from such a reality belongs to those special enough to carry its burdens. Modern day and contemporary racism equates to a form of psychological terrorism with the intent to nullify the strengths of another, whilst those broken to its will suffer inhumane denigration that is inflicted with precise purposes of an unseen aggression of spiritual warfare. The day that the great white raised its glazed razor-sharp teeth from the right waves of Cronulla Beach in a frenzied attack, intoxicated on rum, fueled viciousness and anger, ripping into all that was different, was the day that the lies and the deceit of the political leaders who continue to state that Australia is the world's greatest example of how a multicultural country can tolerate difference certainly made me think that I wouldn't like to see the worst. This is your story, from lollipops to bullets. Eeny, meeny, miny, moe, catch a nigger by the toe. If he hollows, let him go, eeny, meeny, miny, moe. Bar, bar, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full. One for the master, one for the dame, and one for the little boy who lives down the lane. 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indians and 4 little Indian boys. And you all know how the rest of that one goes. Let me abos go loose, Lou, let me abos go loose. They're of no further use, Lou, let me abos go loose. From Rolf Harris's Time in Kangaroo Down Sport. All of these nursery rhymes have racial connotations and are racist in their intent and in their meaning. The ice cream truck tune of Mr. Whippy is from a minstrel song titled Nigger Love a Watermelon Ha Ha Ha, considered the most racist expression in modern times. Remember, as a child, for some of us, we would go to the corner deli and would buy a choo-choo bar. The cover of the licorice bar depicted by a gollywog driving a train. The product sold worldwide, however the bar was made originally by the Plaistow Company in Western Australia in the 1950s, along with Redskins and Eskimo pie ice cream bars. All of this confectionery was all racially offensive. And why hasn't coon cheese yet been taken off the supermarket shelves? The derogatory racial term for coon is derived from the word barracoon, a wooden type holding building that was used to house slaves prior to their selling and transport. Many slaves, when temporarily unchained and unshackled, run to the sides of the tall ships and cast themselves into the wild seas as to avoid what the distance held. They would rather perish than to become the white man's property. It's also a word that describes a black actor or actress that takes roles that stereotype black people. They think they have it made, but they become slaves to the same images, aka sellouts. Many would know that there is an understanding and an acceptance that the word picnic is derived from pick-a-nigger, and the purpose of that was entertainment at lynchings, when white people would bring along boxes of food that they would share as they watched black men being lynched and whipped. I am a nigger. I'm a coon, a gollywog, a bung, and I am Sambo. For I have been told so many, many, many times. I was the only black child in a school in Sydney at Villawood East. There wasn't even an Italian or Greek, for Sydney had not yet become a multicultural city, and it was primarily white Anglo-Saxon. I remember fighting my way to school, and when arriving at the school gate every morning for years, a large group of kids waited for me. As I entered through the gate, they would call out, "Here comes the nigger, abbo scabbo, boom," and then they began to spit on me and throw food scraps and rolled up paper, the very things that you would put in the bin. There was also many kids who took great joy in watching it from a distance. They were racist voyeurs. They were the ones who I remembered laughed the loudest and I despised the most. I remember the spit on my face and the sore scrap. So here today I ask you, have you ever felt what it would be like to be treated as a human rubbish bin? Inside the classroom, the racial taunts continued. No other kid would sit near me. I remember being hit by flying objects in the room. I remember the only response ever that a teacher tried to deal with what she saw was simply pulling up the class and saying the most absurd thing. She stated, "You may laugh at Robert because he is different, however, he laughs at you because you're different." or like I could not understand her feeble nor her futile attempt to address such an issue. My first teenage years of experience of racial brutality from police was in Liverpool, Sydney, when a group of young men I was with were walking into the local hotel in the car park. This huge black police vehicle pulled up and all we could hear was, "Hey you, come here." As each of my friends responded to the plainclothes officers, each one heard the same response. "No, not you. He knows who. We want the black one." I heard one say, "Where are you from?" and I replied, "Villawood." He then stated, "Get back there and don't leave that suburb." My white friends could not believe what they heard. However, I had no choice as they remained there until I did. As I didn't leave immediately, they reapproached me and hit me hard across the chest and the back with large, heavy black torches and said, "You are the fucking ones with the axes to grind, not us." I was told later that they were called the 21st Squad and trained in the very suburbs where I grew up prior to taking position in the inner city areas such as Redfern and Newtown. I honoured my friends for stepping up for me and trying to redirect the police's attention away from me. However, it was in vain. From that day on, my life has been plagued by police harassment, abuse and violence. I was refused service at a hotel bar in Cairns when I was 19 years old. As the barmaid stated, management has said no Aboriginals will be served tonight because of the fight the night before. Even though I wasn't at the hotel, I was still denied service. My experience as a child has led me to believe that white people cannot be racially vilified. I have never dismissed the fact that white people through genetics and brain development have actually been born racist and possess the inner spirit of superiority. I no longer believe that racism is a learned behaviour from social environments or family dinner tables. For how can you actually teach bitterness, hatred, anger, torture, such as killings associated with lynchings and burnings? How does a human being formulate the idealism of racism and then justifies its relentless impact on those who succumb to its ruthless intent? Racism is an evolution of superiority, an act of extreme violence that has been at the centre of institutions in this world since so-called civilization. The masters who control the political persuasion and the religious power entitled the rights of European countries and England to enslave the West Africans onto the slave ships that built the newfound lands of the Americas. The original document that gave legal sanction to slavery consisted of 3 signatories. The third signatory was the King of England. The second signatory was a head of the Church of England. And the prime top signature is seen as the world's most morally powerful man, the Pope, head of the world's Catholic Church. Racism is entrenched at the very roots of Western religious belief systems, entrenched with the sexual abuse and the maltreatment of those very little ones who he says, "Suffer unto me." For when you confess or ask for forgiveness, be sure you are pure of thought, just whom you're asking it from. And beware the ricochet from the real meaning of chastity and the sexual morality of the very cloth of innocence and purity. The Blessed Sacrament indoctrinated the very core of the dispossession of our people from the religious ceremonies of the oldest living religious practice on the earth. As the allegiance of the Roman Empire merged with the British Empire, the reliance of the strength of these two empires merged under Christianity that was stolen from the Middle Eastern countries and formed the word religion that gave great power to the evolving of the Western world and the conquering of the world's indigenous lands. It was not long after this history that in the Western world they began to paint and illustrate Jesus as a white man with blonde hair and blue eyes. I know I was not the first choice as being one of the speakers here today. However, I was dragged up from the cave of the burial site of where the bones of our old people lay deep beneath the earth, our budja. My silence was broken, whilst I still lay bleeding from a fall from a great height. I give my respects to the old people, and I believe in their ways of life. Whilst my heart bled years and years after, I waited for my loved ones to come from behind, never knowing I was in their shadows as they waited for me to crawl wounded and approach. As we saw the rare and the sacred black dolphins appear in the great Derbil Yerrigan, the Swan River, and rise up above the water, we understood that in the darkness, the universe sprinkles fine gold dust, gifts that nullify the emotional pain of loss and deep grief by means of knowledge and understanding the insanity of the unthinkable. I am from Perth, the most racist city in the most racist country in the world. I would like to acknowledge an old Vietnamese couple who ran a Chinese restaurant across from where Dumbartung is located, called the Mei Lin, and was one of the 3 restaurants that was bombed by the leader of the Australian nationalist movement based in Perth, led by Jack Van Tongeren. The neo-Nazi group sprayed swastikas over the building. The then Attorney General of Western Australia, Jim McGuinty, stated in the press that a surge of highly racial propaganda was appearing throughout the city. I give my respects to John Pat, a 14-year-old boy murdered at the hands of police officers in Roban, and was the symbolic death of the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. I would like to acknowledge the brutal racial slaying of young Cleon Jackman, who was so brutally slain that the media was restricted from making public the horrors of his death. He was killed by members of the Ku Klux Klan. Louis Johnson, murdered by a group of racist thugs in Scarborough. Carl Woods, Ricky Vincenti, Mr Ward, Jaluka Jew, and the many others who fell to racism and their lives taken. I'd like to thank Mr Tonto Sansbury and the people of the Nunga Territories for inviting myself from Dumbartung to speak here today on a very contentious and ever-evolving human crisis and disease called racism. It's complex, it's a preconception and perplexed. It's part of an aspect that lays at the very core of the mental well-being of many who suffer from it, and has been a factor in self-injury, suicide, and lack of appropriate social and cultural transitions. It's distorted the realisms of history with deceit and lies, and censored the truth from the minds of human beings by means of political, educational and religious influences from birth to death. Its treachery flows like bad blood of fire through all levels of learning, from pre-primary school nursery rhymes to the primary, secondary and tertiary levels of learning. It's primarily the white perspective and European historians that have written the curriculum of lies and deceit to cover up the crimes of colonial genocide. It's institutionalised. It's at the heart of the relationships between Aboriginal people and the government authorities, such as the police departments and the private security forces that maintain to brutalise and create psychological and emotional fear into the lives of our people. There are specific parliamentary laws that ensure the incarceration of our people, especially our young. The most notorious of these racially based laws is the 3 strikes and you're in for 12 months. It's a mandatory law where judges cannot utilise their discretion to evaluate the circumstances of an individual's life. It's a racially abhorrent law that was adopted straight from the Los Angeles judiciary to counter-attack the gang-related activity of inner-city African-American gang crime. I would like to talk today from a lived experience of racism, as I'm not a researcher nor am I an academic. I despise the political distractions that are created to divert the focus of human rights nullifying the strongest resistance to meaningless trivia, such as inspired smoking ceremonies, the relentless deceit of welcome to country, constitutional recognition, and the absurdity of reconciliation, whilst they continue to exploit our religious belief systems, where our great and spiritual sacred sites are turned into profitable tourist attractions. I despise most of all the lies that value and respect our culture when they commercialise its worth by policies of government that industrialises its wealth to dollars. My mother was born 82 years ago. She passed away at the age of 66 years old. She was born in the shadows of a great southern hospital in Western Australia. My grandmother, Lily Underwood, was not permitted into the general hospital because she was an Aboriginal woman. My mother was born amongst the scraps inside a chook pen coop. My wife here today was born in an annex, a mile from the Narrogin Hospital, because in 1958, Aboriginal women were also not permitted to be registered into the major wards of the regional hospital systems. Australia has been built on the bedrock of genocide, from which racism stems as a stronghold of fear and anguish, to give evidence of the disease of mind censorship and physical fear that by will or trickery empowers the belief that the stronger has the metal and the weaker possess the noose. They begin to turn our brothers against our brothers. The 1905 Native Welfare Act was a declaration of war against our people, which followed the forced occupation of our lands by means of open killing fields, poisoning of water holes, disease and virus-ridden infected blankets, and poisoned handkerchiefs and foodstuffs. The blood of our people dripped from the leaves of the trees and the bushes, and blood soaked the ground, yet near invisible on the red coats of the English military soldiers. Nowhere else on this planet was a country that through legislated law gave the legal right to actually kidnap young babies and children from their biological parents and institutionalise them into church-based run facilities called missions, akin to concentration camps of war. You could rightfully call this legalised human trafficking. Forced indoctrination of foreign belief systems and forbidding the tongue of their mother's ancient language was a breeding process of the most severe form of assimilation imaginable, whilst the priests and the nuns sang their prayers loudly overhead, saying, "Repent your sins to the Lord Jesus for forgiveness," as they began the assaults of rape and torture. When these young children were released from the missions, they were forced to become slave labour to industries such as the stock, land clearing and domestic duties. The very same men who devised the Native Welfare Act, A.O. Neville and others, were also sent to Africa to help the Dutch develop the Apartheid Act. There are many more young Aboriginal people who die every night in this country than there are deaths of young Palestinians on the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian struggle is covered internationally in the media every week around the world. However, the death of our young people hardly raises a whisper. The Australian government should be taken to the international courts and charged with war crimes against humanity. I remember a very challenging day in my life. As I arrived home in the early evening, my son was laying in his bed face to the wall. I remember hearing him sniffling and crying. He was a young man who just started high school. I asked him what the matter was, and he said, "You wouldn't know, you've never been called a nigger." I said, "Bob, I was so used to being called that name, it became my middle name." As a teardrop rolled down my cheek, I began to recall the horrors that I faced at school as a young black boy after many years, and realised it was now happening to my son. He turned slightly to acknowledge me, however, never looked me in the eyes. Bob rarely ever did. I never knew how to console him. I never knew what to really say. My heart began to bleed for my son as I knew exactly what he was feeling. However, this disease did not allow me to hold him in my arms, and for that I could never forgive those who perpetrated the sickness, nor for my own weakness towards it, and for that I could never forgive myself. I realised my son's heart was beginning to turn to stone. As a teardrop fell from his eye, I could feel his aloneness, his anguish, and his will of spirit, unable to escape the warnings that within the emptiness of souls being destroyed are reflections in the mud puddles of life that show that the child who hates is the one that loves the most. This is the true curse of racism that lays at the heart of all young people. A number of years later, Bob found a place where in the darkness he saw the circling skies and placed the feathers of our great Karak, the fire-bringer, Wadong, the crow, and the Manich, the white cockatoo, around the bands of his forearms, and would have seen his shadow pass over the clouds from the corner of a watering eye in a state of bliss. I love and I miss his sense of humour, his grace and his love for his people and his family. And then I saw the final tear of my mother, who from that chook pen reflected the sorrow and the pain of washing away the suffering with alcohol. As her tear fell, I looked into the rubbish bin of life, and I realised that our story of Dumbartung is a spirit of healing, the hurt and the despair of our young people, whose lives are eclipsed by a shadow of life and death, where we wipe the blood that trickles down their wrists and help heal the injuries inflicted to know that they're still alive. The sensitive and the spiritual essence of our young people's humanity is hardened to become what they want you to believe you are, attacking every human right of your freedom of a child of the universe. I see our young standing proud with love and peace in their hearts and a will of determination to survive, not from the empowerment of the knowledge of the white man's education that often states knowledge is power, but from the legacies of the spiritual knowledge of our old people, which continues to merge through our dreams and our enlightenments. This knowledge is pivotal and vital. It underpins the value of who we are and the understanding of Aboriginal people's connection to the spiritual realms that connect to the communication of humanity and the new world of values and relationships that are evidently excluded and censored from academic and religious beliefs and doctrines. This knowledge is powerful and belongs to all those who can embrace the difference between slavery and freedom. Yagan stated to Advocate George Fletcher Moore on the eve of his death, "You come to our country, you have driven us from these lands. We can no longer walk in our own country, we are fired on by the white man. Why should the white man treat us so?" He was declared an outlaw. Following his death, his head was severed from his body, his skin flayed to remove his ceremonial markings. Sometime later, his head was placed on a pole for all the public to see in St George's Terrace as a deterrent to black resistance. In 1839, Fletcher Moore stated, "We are no match for them, our only hope is to set them against each other. Junga Minya Bomaga, the smell of the white man is killing us," was a statement made by Yagan's mother as she described the death of her people as they breathed in the viruses of the white man's sickness. In loving memory of all those who were forced to the fire and the gas chambers of Auschwitz, to the political cells of Africa's Robben Island, the world's bloodiest massacre sites, Wounded Knee in the United States of America, Pinjarra in Western Australia, the Black War of Rain in Tasmania, Australia, Mile Creek, Australia, Butchers and Skull Creek Massacres, Australia, Sand Creek Massacres, Indian Lands, United States of America, the Washita Massacre in the United States of America, the Appin Massacres, Australia, the Coniston Massacres, Australia, Forest River Massacre, Australia, Mystic Massacre, United States of America, the Appalachian Massacre, United States of America, the Bloody Falls Massacre, Northern Alaska, the Battle of Blood River, the Weenan Massacre, Africa, and to all those shackled and chained and transported to the death camp known as Rottnest Island in our language as Wanjama. May all your spirits rest in peace and may our campfires burn forever.
They've gone from stealing bikes to stealing lives. So many young hands grip a stainless steel knife. See a kid they don't like, they're messing him up. What's wrong or what's right is giving less of a fuck. Sticking them up, left, right, stitching them up. Everything revolves around getting the cut. Middle fingers up, fisticuffs, pissing it up. Before the pen license, fists in the cuffs. They don't use them to pack shells, they use them to pack cells. Up in the system before they even crack 12. You can paint a pretty picture using northern pastels, but it's black and white and the latter still sells. What kind of life is